In Chapter 1, the issue was the gap between a legally sufficient story and a fully coherent one. But in Chapter 2, the question gets more specific. How does early uncertainty become the official story? Hi, my name is Stina. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new here. I approach true crime from a pattern-based perspective, which means I'm not just looking at what the story says. I'm looking at how the story is framed, how details become fixed, and where uncertainty starts to disappear. And in this video, we are continuing my breakdown of Broken Plea, Chapter 2, where the early witness accounts, the investigative language, and the plea narrative start to raise some serious questions about how the official story took shape. In Chapter 1 of the book Broken Plea, I talked about the difference between a legally sufficient narrative and a coherent narrative. A plea agreement can give the court enough of a story to move the case forward. It can establish a version of events that's legally acceptable. But that doesn't always mean the story is fully explained. Chapter 2 takes that idea even further. This chapter isn't just asking what investigators eventually concluded. It is asking something more basic. What story was built first? And who helped build it? In this chapter, the narrative isn't coming from a single source. It comes from the surviving roommates. It comes from Hunter Johnson and the others who arrived before police. It comes from Officer Nunez and the first officers who walked into a chaotic scene. And it also comes from the later police reports, body cam footage, supplemental reports, evidence logs, and the public-facing version most people eventually heard. That's the lens I'm using here. I'm not treating Chapter 2 as a list of random inconsistencies. Instead, I'm looking at how the narrative actually formed, how early statements became structure, how early assumptions shaped direction, and how a messy, traumatic scene later turned into a much cleaner story. That's the real issue in this chapter, in my opinion. Before we can ask what the physical evidence proves, we first have to ask whether the scene was controlled well enough, early enough, for that evidence to speak clearly. And Chapter 2 raises some serious questions about that. Not accusations, just questions. There's a difference. Chapter 2 begins with Officer Nunez and the earliest law enforcement response. One of the first things the author focuses on is the idea that Nunez may have made an early assumption about what happened before fully examining the scene. According to the body cam, Nunez calls out an initial cause of death, quote, "I think he might have killed himself," without getting within 5 feet of the victims. The author also notes that he does not check Ethan for vital signs and does not bend down to examine Xana. When Officer Warner asks, "How'd you get there?" Nunez reportedly answers that he sees blood and indicates he has not yet done a full examination. I want to pause here for a moment. When I first read about this early cause of death declaration, I wondered what difference could it possibly make, especially since we now know none of the victims were ruled self-harm. But I think the point the author is making is not that this statement changed the final medical findings. The point is that the first frame matters. In any investigation, especially at a crime scene, that initial assumption can quietly shape what people notice next. Even if it's understandable, even if it's completely human, it can still become the lens through which later details are interpreted. And that is where confirmation bias can begin, not necessarily maliciously, not consciously, but structurally. This is one of the biggest frames of Chapter 2. The chapter isn't just asking what investigators eventually decided. It is asking what they assumed first, and whether those early assumptions quietly shaped the story that came later. That brings us to one of the strangest and most important details in Chapter 2, the steak knife. Before we ever get to the K-bar sheath, Chapter 2 introduces another edged weapon in the scene, a steak knife. According to the chapter, Hunter Johnson said he grabbed a kitchen knife for protection after seeing Xana on the bedroom floor and not knowing whether anyone else was still inside the house. Later, Detective Talbot's report describes a small steak knife on the folding table, or beer pong table, near red Solo cups and what appeared to be blood. That knife was eventually logged as Exhibit 022, steak knife located on folding table in living room. I want to be very clear here. I'm not accusing Hunter of anything wrong. I don't believe that knife was used in the murders, and I'm certainly not suggesting it was the murder weapon. That isn't the point. The point is much more basic. In a house where 4 people were killed with an edged weapon, another edged weapon appearing early in the scene shouldn't just become background noise. Even if Hunter's explanation is completely innocent, and it very well may be, that object still had to be properly accounted for. From a crime scene's perspective, it needed to be documented, secured, tested, and ruled out. Chapter 2 makes this more complicated because the issue isn't just that the knife existed, it's that its movement and documentation don't sound entirely clean. Hunter reportedly had or mentioned the knife. Nunez's report says he told Hunter to leave it and go downstairs. But according to the author, the body cam footage doesn't clearly show Nunez acknowledging, securing, or even mentioning the knife. When I watched that moment on body cam, what stood out wasn't that Hunter did anything suspicious. It was the tension in the scene itself. Nunez had just come from Xana's room. The house wasn't fully cleared, and a civilian was mentioning a knife. That situation should raise immediate concerns for evidence preservation. In hindsight, this was a quadruple homicide. But even in that moment, officers knew they had at least 2 apparent stabbing victims. That alone should have made the presence of a loose knife something that needed clear handling. So the real question isn't whether this proves anything sinister. The question is whether the movement of that knife was clearly documented, from Hunter's hands or mention of it, to the table, to its final logging as Exhibit 022. But thus, this is where Chapter 2 shifts. It stops being about one strange knife and starts being about scene control, documentation, and evidence preservation. A knife on a beer pong table is one thing. A knife near apparent blood in a house where 4 people were killed with an edged weapon is something else entirely. It's not proof, but it's not nothing. And that concern matters because the same crime scene process that handled Exhibit 022 is the one we're being asked to trust with the most important piece of evidence in the entire case, the K-bar sheath. As we all know by now, the K-bar sheath is treated as a clean anchor in the case, the item left behind with DNA on the snap, becoming the central physical link to Bryan Kohberger. In the simplified version of the story, the sheath feels like the center pin holding the entire prosecution narrative together. But Chapter 2 raises a basic problem. Where exactly was it found? According to the later public and prosecution narrative, the sheath was found in the bed, lodged beneath or near Maddie Mogen's body or thigh area. But according to the author, Detective Talbot's contemporaneous handwritten evidence receipt describes it differently. Quote, knife, K-bar sheath, on floor, next to Vic number 3. End quote. That is not a small detail. That is the foundation. If the sheath is the cornerstone evidence, then its original location should be crystal clear. Was it on the bed? Was it on the floor next to victim number 3? And if it moved, who moved it, when, and was that movement properly documented? Chain of custody doesn't begin once an item is already in evidence. It begins with its origin, where it was first found, who saw it first, who collected it, and whether the earliest documentation matches the later narrative. I'm not saying this proves the sheath was planted, or that I know exactly what happened with it. What I am saying is that if DNA evidence depends on this object, then its documented origin is crucial. And Chapter 2 suggests that the origin may not be as clean as a later story makes it sound. That's the issue. The public-facing narrative compresses the sheath into a simple story. The killer leaves the sheath has DNA, the DNA connects to the suspect. But Chapter 2 slows that down and asks, before it became the anchor of the case, was it documented clearly enough? Now we have Exhibit 022, the steak knife, followed by Exhibit 14, the K-bar sheath. The question is no longer whether the scene was messy. It is whether the most important piece of evidence in the case has a clear, stable, documented origin. If the answer isn't obviously yes, then we have a serious narrative problem. Not necessarily a legal problem that could stop a plea, but a coherence problem, a trust problem, a how exactly did this story become so clean later problem. And that brings us to the larger issue Chapter 2 keeps circling. The scene was not intact. Before we talk about what the evidence proves, we have to ask what condition the scene was in when police finally secured it. According to the chapter, Hunter Johnson was reportedly the first outside person to enter the house after the crimes. He entered through the locked front door using a punch code. He found Dylan and Bethany in Bethany's room, went upstairs, entered Xana's room, and saw Xana and Ethan. He then went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, returned to the room, checked the closet, and checked Xana and Ethan for a pulse, later believing he left the knife on the folding table. I'm not criticizing Hunter for any of that. If you walk into a situation like that, you're not thinking like an investigator. You're reacting like a person who just encountered something horrifying. You're trying to figure out whether people are still alive, whether someone else is inside, and whether you're in danger. So this isn't a moral judgment. It's an evidence question, because if someone entered the house before police, moved through multiple rooms, handled a knife, and checked the bodies, then the scene police arrived at was not untouched. And that changes how we have to view the evidence collected there. Chapter 2 raises another issue that further complicates the condition of the scene: the front door. A neighbor walking his dog that morning reportedly saw the front door wide open between 9 and 10 a.m., and again around 11 a.m. Yet Hunter later entered through a locked front door using the punch code. This creates a very basic question. If Dylan and Bethany were locked in Bethany's room and never left, then who closed and locked the door? That's not a dramatic question or an accusation. It is a crime scene integrity question. If the front door was wide open earlier that morning and later found locked, then the condition of the scene changed before law enforcement secured it. Someone closed that door. Someone locked it. Or the observation was wrong. Or the timeline is incomplete. Either way, it has to be accounted for. The later narrative often focuses on the sliding glass door as the exit point of the suspect, likely based on Dylan's account. But that doesn't make the front door irrelevant. A door seen wide open hours after the crimes could still point to movement in or out of the house. It raises real questions about whether the scene remained intact, or whether someone altered it before police arrived. This is exactly what I mean by narrative coherence. The legal narrative may not need to explain every movement between 4 a.m. and noon, but if we're trying to understand the true condition of the crime scene, those movements matter. Before the evidence can tell us what happened, we need to know what happened to the environment around the evidence. Was a house properly secured? Who entered? Who left? Who touched what? What was documented? What was assumed? And what was later simplified? These aren't side questions. They are the foundation. This also connects to the surviving roommates' accounts. And I want to be careful here. People in trauma don't behave like trained investigators. They freeze. They delay. They rationalize. They do go into survival mode. So when I talk about Dylan and Bethany, I'm not talking about blame or anything like that. I'm talking about narrative formation. Their accounts became part of the foundation of the story. Chapter 2 raises questions about how fixed those accounts were early on versus how fixed they became later. According to the author, the body cam footage shows Dylan giving a relatively vague description that day of the suspect, saying he was around 5'8" to 6 feet tall, not necessarily in the kitchen, and without identifying the person as white or Caucasian.
The guy that you saw, and it was dark, right? Or were there lights on in the house?
I think there were lights on in the house, I believe.
Okay.
I don't really know what he looked like because he had a mask, but he wasn't like super tall.
How tall are you?
I'm 5'10". I think it was maybe my height an inch or two higher or lower. I can't really remember.
Yet, in later investigative descriptions, her account appears more specific. Hearing a male voice say, "It's okay, Kaylee, I'm here for you." Seeing a person around 5'10", dressed in black with a ski mask, standing in the kitchen, making eye contact, and identifying the person as Caucasian through the eye cutouts. That contrast matters. It doesn't automatically mean Dylan was lying, and it doesn't mean investigators fabricated anything. But it does raise a serious question about how witness accounts develop over time and how much of the later narrative was clearly present in the earliest version. This is what the author calls narrative hardening, when early uncertainty slowly turns into later certainty. A witness may describe something vaguely at first. An officer may write it more definitively. That report gets repeated. The media summarizes it, and eventually the uncertainty fades. And this is one of the biggest issues in Chapter 2. It's not just about whether people said inconsistent things. It is about how statements gathered in shock became part of the official structure. Dylan's account, Bethany's account, Hunter's account, Officer Nunez's early impressions. The various reports, the evidence logs, and the final prosecution narrative, they are all layers. Some of those layers may not line up cleanly, yet the later story still presents as clean. That is the gap. This is why I keep returning to the difference between legal sufficiency and narrative coherence. A plea doesn't have to answer every public question. It doesn't have to explain every report discrepancy or every movement in the house before police arrived. Legally, it may only need to be sufficient. But if we're analyzing the story underneath that legal closure, then those gaps cannot simply be brushed aside. Chapter 2 shows us that the official story did not emerge from a clean, controlled environment. It emerged from a chaotic house, a delayed 911 call, surviving roommates in trauma, friends entering before police, a front door that may have been opened and then locked, a moving steak knife, and a sheath with a possible location discrepancy. That doesn't automatically mean the final conclusion is wrong, but it does mean the path to that conclusion was messier than the later narrative suggests. And that is exactly where the analysis belongs. not in declaring what definitely happened, but in asking whether the story we were given is as coherent as it sounds. So for me, chapter 2 is not just about the steak knife. It's not just about the K-bar sheath. And it is not just about the open front door. It is about something much bigger, in my opinion. It is about how a crime scene becomes a story and how that story becomes the official version. Before we ask what the evidence proves, we have to ask whether the early scene was controlled well enough and documented clearly enough for the later narrative to rest on it. And chapter 2 raises real questions about that. Not wild questions, not conspiracy questions, basic ones. Who entered the house? What did they touch? What did they see? What did police assume? What did reports preserve and what did they smooth over? Where exactly was the sheath found? What really happened with the steak knife? And if the front door was open earlier and locked later, who changed the condition of that scene before police arrived? That to me is the heart of chapter 2. Early uncertainty quietly became the official story. And once uncertainty hardens into structure, people stop seeing it as uncertainty. They start seeing it as fact. That is why this chapter matters. It slows the story down before it hardens. It asks us to look carefully at the foundation before accepting the frame built on top of it. And whether you believe the plea narrative is enough or not, chapter 2 makes one thing very clear. The scene was not simple. The early documentation was not simple. And the story that came later may be legally sufficient, but that does not mean it is fully coherent. So that's where chapter 2 leaves us. Not with certainty, not with a fully proven alternate theory, but with a serious problem in the way the story is being held together. If you're following this breakdown because you want to look beneath the surface of the official narrative, make sure you're subscribed. In the next part, I'm going to keep walking through the places where the story becomes more fixed and where the unanswered questions still matter. And as always, I'm not asking you to believe a theory. I'm asking you to notice the framing. Thank you for checking in with me, and see you in the next one.